activists and community members from Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Wabanaki, and other communities came together, not for the first time, to organize a memorial that was taking place on this important waterway. And part of what their work was in this Deer Island Memorial was remembering and honoring the forced removal of ancestors in the late 17th century during a conflict sometimes called King Philip's War. And as you can see from the picture, this was an arduous undertaking. It was cold. It was happening in late autumn, which is the same season in which their ancestors were removed from their home places at Natick and other locations. And it took the paddlers right through the heart of a city, which has so long attempted to deny the existence or the continuance of Indigenous people. And yet, this canoe journey was a powerful reminder that these communities endure today as sovereign nations, and that the memories of what has happened in the 17th century have not faded. They remain as strong as ever and shape the work that is occurring in the 21st century. So I will return to Deer Island and say more about why this site of incarceration, of attempted genocide, and of survival has remained so visible and so noted within community understandings as we go along today. But to give a bit more context, I really want to take a little time at the outset to locate myself and the work that I am sharing with you today within some really long-standing networks. And to say that I am not discovering anything, I am instead bringing together many forms of stories, of knowledge, of memory, of perspectives across potentially thousands of years. So the place that I have come from, I traveled in yesterday, is the homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican community. They live along the Mahiokanu, or the waters that are never still, and have been forcibly relocated, removed to Wisconsin as a consequence of colonization. This is an experience that is very connected to the topic for today. I also wanted to note that the community continues to do immensely important work of history keeping, of memory making, of education and interpretation to ensure that their experiences are understood. And this is just one example, a walking tour they have developed that carries forward this really important work in place around stories. Zooming out a little bit so that you can see and maybe make in your mind some connections, a number of the tribal nations, Indigenous communities in the Northeast that I may be referencing or pointing to today. And this is my way of, again, locating myself as a non-Indigenous person within these long-standing networks of relations. Each of these tribal communities and Indigenous nations has cared for places, maintained connections, done essential work to bring forward the experiences of ancestors despite enormous pressures. So with that as a little orientation, I then wanted to bring to us some words that have really sat with me as a person, as a teacher, as a writer, as a researcher, as someone who seeks other forms of action in the 21st century, and shaped my thinking for a number of years. And I hope that we can have these in mind as I go along today and maybe relate to some questions you may have around memory and what the work and the significance of history is today. These are some words from Ramona Peters. She is a Mashpee Wampanoag elder, and she wrote this in an essay from a number of years ago regarding work that she and her family have long done in repatriation, or bringing home ancestors and belongings that have been forcibly taken from Wampanoag homelands. She writes, "The past has everything to do with who we are in this present moment, both individually and collectively. Personal and collective histories shape our dominant thought patterns, what we value, what we desire, and what we miss." This is a passage that I often bring into my history classes in order to start a conversation about how history is very live. It's not something that lives on a bookshelf or over there or can be picked up once a year, but instead shapes the everyday experiences of communities. It shapes memories, it shapes where we are going. And it often does this in very different ways, depending on which community we may be listening to or thinking with. This is also a way of connecting into some of the larger ways that I see history. So not as an academic endeavor that lives in narrow little boxes, but something that has really widespread social effects in the world and goes all the way back and much further to the topic of today. So some of the key words that I wanted to put on the table, because they are part of a vocabulary of thinking about memory and place, the communities have led, involve restoration, reconnection, repatriation, or bringing back ancestors and lands and forms of knowledge that may have been stolen or lost over many generations, and relations. Some of these relations are between Indigenous nations, some of them are with other communities, some of them have been immensely productive and valued and cherished, some have been contentious and violent. And this is my way of prelude to the book that I wrote, because it is not only about a moment in time in the 17th century Northeast, it is about so much more and a larger geography and set of relations. And so I hope today that you can draw connections with your own places and your own communities and think with me about what this work of memory requires of us, where it may send us, where it may push us, where it may make us uncomfortable, where it may bring us to new forms of relations in the 21st century. So to get us into the space that I really want to be focusing on this morning, this is one map of the Native Northeast, sharing this from my friend and colleague Lisa Brooks from her book that I highly recommend titled The Common Pot, The Recovery of Native Space in the Northeast. And you may notice looking at this that it is not the same as many maps featured in, say, textbooks that you may have encountered in school, or highway maps, or other kinds of signage. It does not show state boundaries. It does not show the United States-Canadian border. Instead, this is a geography of Indigenous spaces. And without going into all of the details of this incredibly rich map, it helps us begin to see the depth of homelands across the Native Northeast. And I think this is an essential starting place to recognize how deeply peopled and valued and stewarded these lands have been since the beginning of time for the communities across this wide expanse. The word, the Dawnland, a reference to the fact that when the sun rises and meets this continent each day, it meets this place first. And the white light of the dawn shines upon the communities who are here. And so there's an intimate connection, as communities have emphasized, between identity and place. And then we might also think about what the effects of being pushed out of these places are when a community's own sense of grounding is in these particular lands and waters that are both inland and coastal. To give you a sense of the motivation for this project within this geography, I thought it would be helpful to bring to us a few events that have attained different forms of media coverage, recognition, controversy in recent years. So within this Dawnland, and here I will go back for a moment, if we look down here, this is where this photograph is from. It is a place called Patuxet within Wampanoag homelands. You may have learned about Patuxet in school as a child. Perhaps you remember something about the first Thanksgiving or different stories of encounter that are often very formative to elementary school children when they're beginning to learn about the United States. This is one story, but what I want to help surface here is a very different set of understandings of the 17th century and the impacts of colonization among the Indigenous communities at Patuxet and other related communities. So what you're looking at here is a gathering that takes place every year in late autumn on the holiday, sometimes called Thanksgiving, but called by community members who take part in this and their supporters the National Day of Mourning. And you can see the folks who have gathered, this image is from 2014, are surrounding an important statue of the Usamiquan or Massasoit. That is a reference to a leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, who is also the father of King Philip or Metacom, the leader of an Indigenous resistance movement. So generationally, a deep history there. Why gather in this space, and what is the National Day of Mourning? As community members like Kisha James, who is from Aquinnah Wampanoag, has emphasized, this is an organized effort to recall not a sanitized or easy or kind of conciliatory story around Thanksgiving, but rather the impacts of what was occurring in the 17th century as English ships began to come over and bring colonizers into these Wampanoag homelands. What I wanted to highlight from this photo, this is a gathering from 2021, are two aspects. One, we are not vanishing. We are not conquered. We are as strong as ever. This protest and protective movement, in so many ways, is speaking back against a really durable form of mythology, of erasure. And this is not unique to New England. It takes different forms across the United States, but it has tried to presume that Native people have vanished. They have gone away, they have been destroyed, they have been removed forever from these places. And that is not true. And yet, that is a deeply rooted mythology. The other part of this, at the bottom where it says Spirit of Metacom, National Day of Mourning, the reference here to Metacom, again, the son of the Massasoit or Usamiquan, who organized an Indigenous resistance movement that came out of long-standing efforts to try to secure Indigenous well-being in the Northeast as this onslaught of colonization is pressuring communities' abilities to survive in so many ways. And so Metacom here is being referenced as someone honored, revered, a touchstone, an icon, right? But this has not always been the case. So you may recall from much news coverage over the last number of years, there have been many discussions around monuments. What is marked? What is not marked? Whose stories are told? Why? And what are the implications? I'm going to take you into a New England version of this. In so many parts of colonial New England, this revered Indigenous leader, Metacom or King Philip, his name is trivialized. It is commodified. It is, sorry, getting over a little cold. It is put on auto sales shops, on apartment buildings where it's misspelled, and represented in no way that has actual bearing on the individual of the 17th century, right? And this kind of what I refer to as a memory scape, right? These signs that surround us and attempt to carry forward certain stories is often totally unaddressed in space, right? There's not a counter monument or something put up next to these signs to tell people a fuller story. And this is a landscape that many people in New England grow up next to, not asking other questions and taking this at face value. And yet, right, it has always been contested. It has always been understood otherwise, but communities who are descendants of survivors of the 17th century and its violences. To take you a little deeper, and here we're gonna get into it, right? There was a protest in 2010, in Providence, Rhode Island. So Narragansett homelands, organized in the shadow of the Rhode Island state capitol. And the protest object was a board game that was in production. An entertainment company was in the process of producing a game on the theme of King Philip's War, where players could choose to inhabit the character, for instance, of an English military leader and move around a game board to burn down native villages, right? This was going to be produced in 2010, community members organized and came out with signs saying, "Stop playing the genocide game. Genocide is not native to these shores, right? Genocide is not a game." And really calling to attention very sharply what that board game was teaching people. This game got produced nonetheless, right? And so I share this as one insight into how I think about the dynamics of memory, that there is often a back and forth, a push and pull. Something is created, there is a response, right? And then the results of that vary a lot. But this is one way in which we can begin to see the immense contentiousness of memory, right, around this time period and its ongoing significances. And just one more example here, because I think this brings home the larger stakes of this work. This image from 2018, Mashpee Wampanoag members organizing out on the land to protest US federal efforts to remove some of their tribal lands from a federal trust status. This would have immensely impacted their ability to exercise sovereignty and well-being in their own homelands. And this sign, I think, is this banner is so significant. Our people equals our land equals our people. So this for me is a clear lens onto how significant memory and place are. They are connected and they have everything to do with communities' abilities today and in the future to be in certain places and to carry out their full forms of living, or to be challenged and prevented in that. You may be thinking this is a lot of backstory, but I see this as really essential to not just begin with the 17th century, but rather start in the 21st and help us see the continuing stakes of doing history given these ongoing dynamics. Two more quick references, and then I will take us back in time. So here I really want to, with great enthusiasm, recognize someone very local to here, Dr. Jeannie O'Brien, who is White Earth Ojibwe and a professor at the University of Minnesota. I highly recommend her book, Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, because it gives us a very rich vocabulary for thinking about memory. How have monuments been made? By whom? For what purposes? And as she argues in this transformative book, there is this pervasive form of erasure in New England and more broadly that attempts to remove Indigenous people from modernity, meaning present these experiences as if there is not Indigenous continuance in the 21st century. And so as she talks about this construction of a pervasive myth of Indian extinction, I would invite us to keep that in mind as I go further today, and all of the ways in which this is coming up and being manifested in the wake of King Philip's War. The final critical connection here, because I know that many of you are readers, avid readers, you may have read the book titled The Name of War by the historian Jill Lepore, which was a path-breaking study on King Philip's War that won the Bancroft Prize in the late 1990s. I read this book as an undergraduate, and I still have my copy of it. It is filled with notations, and many of those notations are admiring of the intense work it did in archives and documents, right, written documents. And it's also filled with question marks and points of disagreement, forceful disagreement, where I did not find myself convinced by what she was saying. And the particular place where I want to have us thinking today is around how we recall, right? Do we look at written documents? Is that the start and end of our journey? Do we account for oral histories and oral traditions or important material belongings the communities have cherished and maintained over many years? Do we think about the land itself as an archive and a way of knowing? And as you may guess, I am of the latter thinking, right? But there was a moment in Jill Lepore's book that really sat with me and troubled me as an undergraduate, where she writes about King Philip's War and its remembrance, quote, how those Algonquians or native people who survived this commemorated and remembered the war is sadly mere speculation. That is not true, right? And so the question that I'm offering for us to have in mind, whose memories and forms of knowledge are being recognized or ignored or sidelined, and what are the consequences of that? And I hope that I can offer you a couple of touchstones for a different accounting. So with that, I'm going to take you on a very brief tour through several thousand years of history as a way of laying some groundwork for this Indigenous resistance movement of King Philip's War. And the argument here is that you cannot understand the 17th century by beginning in the 17th century. You need to look back tens of thousands of years for any of this to make sense, right? And that is often not how colonial history books have been written. So moving rapidly, but come with me here to several places as we think about memory and place. The first point I wanted to emphasize here is the importance of beginning with the lands and the waters and the people as all connected, and forms of relationships between humans and other than human beings, animals, other species that have always been constitutive for Indigenous communities' ways of knowing and being. And in this case, I wanted to start us with a beaver lodge. This is located in Mohican homelands. If you have ever spent time around beavers, you will know that they are extremely active creatures and they can flood out land before you know it. In some ways, they have more influence than humans, right? And I offer this as a lens onto how thinking with Indigenous forms of knowing that really center these types of relationships begins to change the story, right? This is not wilderness. This is not empty, vacant land. This is not nature. This is a homelands where there are deep interconnections and forms of relation that span thousands of years. The beaver figures prominently in a number of origin stories in the Northeast and elsewhere that explain how the land came to be. And I think of these as memoryscapes as well. So the image you're seeing here, if you can look for the shape of the beaver on the land in the place known as Kitsiamisku in South Deerfield, Massachusetts, the head is at the right, the body in the middle, the tail going off to the left. Pardon for that. The Great Beaver is the location of an important origin story that goes back countless generations. And if you're interested in more on this, I highly recommend work by Lisa Brooks and Marge Bruchac. The short version of this is that these origin stories explain that in ancient times there had been great creatures, and the beaver was one of them, who had done as beavers do and dammed up all the water and was holding all the water back in a giant lake. And for the beaver, this was wonderful. This was a very valued achievement it had made, but it was impacting everyone else downstream. They did not have enough water. They were not able to sustain life. They were thirsty. They were stressed. And so another enormous creature and being eventually came in and attacked that great beaver and killed it. And what you are seeing today on the land is the remnants of that great beaver, right? This is not a children's story. As I understand this, this is a story very much about ethics. What does it mean to live responsibly in a place and to not hoard resources, to have consciousness of other relations and their needs and what they will require to also thrive in these places? Once you have heard this story, I promise you, you cannot come through this place and see this landform and not be reminded of this. Right? So this is a form of memory on the land that is so important for us to have in mind, and also to know that I'm sharing here just one of thousands of potential stories about the land and Indigenous place memories. Native communities across the Northeast have been stewards of these lands for thousands of years, even if some of these places of stewardship and protection and caretaking are no longer the same as they had been thousands of years ago. And here I wanted to share an example from the area around Boston Harbor, where there's archaeological evidence underground. If you go in the subway stops, there's actually signs about this, of a fish weir from thousands of years ago. And this is a lens onto how significant the knowledge of waterways and how to corral fish in order to be able to harvest them and support communities has been for thousands of years. You will not see the land the same as it was thousands of years ago because there's been an experience of coastal sea level rise as well as landfill activity in Boston. And so I would also invite us to think about how urban developments have sometimes overwritten places of significance or added new layers to them. Nonetheless, they remain important. And here on the left, you can see community members gathered as part of a recreation of a fish weir in order to emphasize that this is still a continuing place of importance. Another fishing place that I will return to in a little bit, for at least 8,000 years, that's what the archaeology says, probably much longer, as other forms of knowing say, Indigenous people from multiple tribal nations have gathered at a place called Pesquiamscut, which is located in the midpoint of the Connecticut or Connecticut River. And because the fish runs would happen seasonally in the spring, this was a known place of sustenance where communities would come together, not only to fish, but also for diplomacy and socializing and connections with relations they had not seen for many seasons in this cherished place of Pesquiamscut. And again, this is one of thousands of places across the Northeast. This kind of network, right, where each part of the land and the water is deeply known across thousands of years, is the place into which colonizers are entering and assuming it is empty or lightly peopled or not valued. And that is not correct, right? That is a convenient logic for colonizers who are then attempting to claim that land on their own. I also wanted to highlight the fact that monuments, including those made of stone, are not European inventions. They go back to many other communities' practices and beliefs. And here's one example from Mohican homelands, a monument of stones, 18 feet long, 6 feet high, at a valued place known as Monument Mountain. This was mapped by a colonizer in the 18th century, but its larger significance is a place of continuing visitation, where as community members traveled by it, they might deposit a stone as a sign of honoring or reflection on what has come before. And so that kind of participation in a memoryscape is also important for us to be thinking with. It's not just a bronze or stone monument that goes up and is finished, right? This is an ongoing connection. This is a monument or a place that the Stockbridge-Munsee community has very actively interpreted just recently. And part of the interpretation is pointing out that colonizers in this area dismantled the cairn. When they came into this place, they took it apart, right? So also a history of damage and violation. All across the Northeast, communities were thriving for thousands of years, adapting, moving, being in dynamic relation and thriving, enduring various challenges, but sustaining and flourishing. And there are so many locations that we could use to talk about that history before any European arrivals, including places like Salt Pond in Narragansett homelands, which is currently a site of great protection, but also you can see how developments have occurred often over or around places of great sensitivity. This is believed to be one of the most significant Indigenous village sites on the entire eastern seaboard from around the year 1250. So long before 1492, right? And has appeared in almost no colonial accounts of history. But flourishing communities. So here I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about colonization and the impacts of that. The very first Europeans who sailed into these waters of the native Northeast, many of them knew that they were entering these flourishing sovereign Indigenous spaces. And you can see from this map by Samuel de Champlain from 1605, as he travels in by Patuxent, this is not vacant. He is recognizing on this, if you look around the perimeter, Indigenous Wampanoag cornfields, homes, different structures built to fend off the crows, right? So they wouldn't eat the seeds in the fields. And also within this, a thriving network of Indigenous waterways. And in his writing, he talks about this. This is very clearly populated and stewarded. But it is very quickly that things begin to shift. And it doesn't start in 1620 with the arrival of the Pilgrims. It starts in several other ways. One, epidemic disease. There is an epidemic that sweeps through indigenous homelands all along the coast and devastates communities. It is believed to have impacted up to 90% population loss in some of these places. And as communities have spoken about this, imagine the impact of losing 90% of a community. All of the knowledge, all of the leadership, all of the strength and ability to organize would have been impacted. And that is some of the environment into which the Pilgrims are coming. Right? There is also, before 1620, a history of English colonizers kidnapping and enslaving Native people from the Patuxet area and other locations. And if you're interested in more on this, the Wampanoag community has produced a really essential public history exhibition and multimedia called Our Story, which narrates this. In 1614, the captivity of cherished relations, including an individual known as Tisquantum, who you may have heard of as Squanto. So he is taken forcibly all the way over to Europe and endures tremendous trials there before eventually making his way back, and then being one of the individuals who meets the Pilgrims. Right? This is some of the backstory that tends to be left out entirely or sanitized in the telling of New England histories. Quite quickly after colonization begins to take root, there are a series of violences and other related forms of stress. And so I'll walk us through just a couple of those. But it is in the 1630s, right? So 15, 16 years after the Pilgrims come over, that the Pequot War breaks out in Pequot homelands, a bit to the west. And this is a story that the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, Eastern Pequot Tribal Nation themselves tell very clearly. I wanted to share this image from the Mashantucket Museum. It's a sovereign cultural space, right? So they interpret their own history. And as it has been explained to me, the very architecture of the building, these soaring beams and glass, echo the form of a palisade or a protected enclosure that Pequot ancestors had created at the village called Mystic in order to protect themselves during the escalating Pequot War. And that palisade was ultimately infiltrated by English and also some indigenous allies and attacked. And this has long been narrated by colonial historians as the end of the Pequots, the last of the Pequots, a massacre that extinguished every single Pequot. There were survivors. And that is another theme of the work here. At every moment, there are survivors, and those survivors have carried on forms of knowing and relating. One of the related stressors of colonization, I think we can approach through the lens of wampum. So sometimes people have heard about these shell beads, these beautiful purple and white beads as money or currency. And that really does not get at the full significance of wampum. These beads are produced from shells that are found in these coastal areas, particularly around Long Island Sound, Narragansett Bay, and were valued historically and today by communities not only as medium of exchange, but also having cultural, spiritual, diplomatic significance. A wampum belt would be presented to bind different communities into relations of responsibility. And this includes indigenous people and other indigenous people. It includes indigenous people and colonizers presenting wampum belts, right? And recognizing responsibilities or not, right? Not holding them up. And the way that I wanted to bring wampum into this is that as these networks of exchange and relationships begin to intensify and become more difficult in the 17th century, English people begin to impose fines on Native community members who they think have violated an English law. For example, a Native person has gone into a space where the English do not want them, and this has violated some expectation or has not paid an agreement. the English courts would then turn around and impose fines on communities and say, you must pay X fathom of wampum. So these long strings of wampum. These beads take hours to produce. And so this was an increasing form of pressure on communities, women and children included, to have to produce more and more beads to pay off those fines through the English legal system. And when communities could not do that, right, thinking of all that time to make wampum, coming away from time to plant and tend to fields or fish or care for those who need assistance, right? When communities could not pay those fines, the English would then turn around again and say, well, you can pay us in land. We will seize your land, right? And so there's this deep connection between the wampum dynamics and land theft. Wampum has appeared in some land documents, and so I wanted to bring this one to you as well. Speaking of efforts that communities took to protect their lands, if you can see in the middle here, I guess I have a pointer. This is surmised to be a pictorial representation of a wampum belt associated with the individual known as Awanunsk, who's a woman leader in the Connecticut River Valley in the mid-17th century. And Awanunsk, along with several of her counselors and advisors, takes many steps to push back against English encroachment on her lands. And I think it's really interesting that her mark here is the wampum belt, right, as a representation of diplomatic expectations. When you read these land documents, this is something else that really has struck me in doing research across the Northeast, so often they are not land sales as the way they have been held up to be. If you actually read them, many of them have very clear language assuring the Native people can maintain certain planting areas, ability to gather chestnuts, ability to fish, ability to hunt, ability to build a village. And that kind of shared use agreement is not what the mythology has tended to focus on, which is much more the expectation that these lands were freely and clearly sold. This is also my moment to say, please, if you are able, go read original documents. Many people work with transcriptions. I certainly work with them. They're very valuable, but they often erase things. And so if you are only looking at the printed version of this, you are not going to see the mark of Awanunsk, right? It's been removed. And so this I always say in my history classes, go to the original. There is most likely information there that will deepen your thinking. So we've talked about several forms of pressure. The other couple that I would mention in the 17th century include religion, the Puritan and Protestant effort to convert Native people to Christianity is widespread and often devastating. And you can see this encapsulated in the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where the emblem of a very caricatured Indigenous person says, "Come over and help us." This is not something that someone was known to have actually said, right? This is a Puritan imaginary that Native people wished to be rescued, quote, and converted to Christianity. One of the ways this expresses itself in place is an English effort to establish what are called, quote, praying towns. And here I want to cite community members who have said they have always been praying. Prayer did not arrive with Christianity. But the effort here by English colonizers and missionaries was to gather Native people into this series of praying towns across Massachusetts area and Connecticut, where they could be more readily surveilled and watched and encouraged, right, or pressured to conform to English ways. And this, I think, has everything to do with an English future expectation of Indigenous assimilation or disappearance as a distinct people. But want to emphasize that these praying towns never functioned in reality in that way. The communities always maintained much more expansive networks and would sometimes confound the missionaries by disappearing for months at a time to fish or hunt or go maple sugaring or do diplomacy, right? So the intention and the reality are always something we should look very carefully at. Just gonna skip that for a moment, but the final point I wanted to mention here is that there's a really long tradition that is related to missionaries of Indigenous uses of writing. So words on paper in a kind of alphabetic way. And some of this has to do with Christianity. The first Bible actually printed in what is described as British North America is actually printed in Indigenous language and Massachusetts Wampanoag Nipmuc. And while its title page here gives the credit to John Eliot, the English missionary, it is in fact James the printer, a Nipmuc man, who did the typesetting and likely involved a number of other Native people in the translation work, right? And if you're interested in more on this, would highly recommend the film We Still Live Here about the Wampanoag community today using this Bible to bring back language. So moving on to, I sometimes bring more pictures than I need, but this is a long way of saying, right, these are some of the contexts for reapproaching King Philip's Forum. And I'll take you through just a couple places that I see as really significant for the waging and remembrance of this conflict. The war begins in 1675 in the summer. And I think everything I have just laid out makes it clear that this did not come out of nothing. It came out of repeated efforts by communities to try diplomacy and negotiation and forms of accommodation and interaction that had nonetheless pushed them off so many of their lands and undermined their sovereignty or their political ability to have their own standing. And so this war comes out of that. It is an effort that communities take on at great cost. They remember the Pequot War. They remember how costly it is to send one's members into war. And this choice, I think, gives us a clear picture of the high stakes in order to secure Indigenous futures. The war begins around King Philip's own home grounds, Narragansett Bay area, Mount Hope. And the couple places I wanted to focus on because they give us a different lens into the escalation of this conflict. The first is Deer Island that I mentioned at the outset, where Indigenous community members are rounded up and brought on canoes and then boats out into Boston Harbor and incarcerated on this site in a very exposed location. This is where I ask if anyone has ever had the pleasure of flying into Logan Airport in Boston. If you have done that, you have seen Deer Island. You circle right over that as you come into the airport, and you may or may not have heard this history. But Deer Island, which today is the site of a sewage treatment plant that has been built over these sensitive grounds, was where hundreds of Indigenous people were forced in the winter without necessary tools or provisions to build shelter and supply themselves. Many, many starved to death, fell ill, perished, or were killed by the elements as the wind in the winter coming off of Boston Harbor impacted them. And there were survivors, right? There are people who survived Deer Island, whose descendants are still here, who managed to return to home places at various points during the war and afterwards, and to get themselves off of this incarceration site. But this is part of an English tactic of confining and trying to isolate different Native communities from each other so they wouldn't be able to communicate and effectively organize this uprising. And it doesn't work, right? The strategy of containment doesn't work. Another place is Great Swamp. So moving forward just a little bit in time, one of the Indigenous strategies as they have seen this war begun to unfold is to seek protection in ways they had done for generations. And for the Narragansetts and the Wampanoags, this takes the form sometimes of going to wetlands or swamps, which were thoroughly known and valued by communities, places of great medicinal significance, right, of spiritual and cultural significance, and also hard to access by the English on their heavy horses with their heavy military gear, right? So the Narragansetts in the late fall go to Great Swamp, which has an island in the middle of it, and they bring with them Wampanoag refugees, including women, children, and elders who are seeking protection in the midst of this onslaught. And under many circumstances, they would have been safe Usually the water that surrounds this does not freeze all the way through, right? So it's like a protective moat. But it was unusually cold that year in the middle of the Little Ice Age. And English troops managed to gain access and attack this much in the way that they did the village at Mystic several decades earlier. And it is a disaster. It is a massacre. The English burn not only indigenous homes, but also so many of the bushels of corn that have been stored there. And I see this as an intentional scorched earth strategy, not only here, but in other places where the English were trying to destroy indigenous food supplies, knowing that if they did not have access to not only food for the next couple months, but also the seeds to plant next year's crops, that would undermine, right, their ability to continue. And so they go after the corn in Great Swamp. And there are survivors. Some of these survivors are enslaved and sent to places around the Atlantic world, and some move to other locations. And here I invite you to think about how many other wetlands there are around Narragansett Bay and surrounding areas. It is a swamp, right? It is all lower-lying coastal land. And through these networks, right, communities were moving, in many cases well off the radar of the English, who had very little access, especially further into the interior. So that strategy of using the land as a refuge and a protective place is something I really tried to emphasize in my book. And some of these swamps are just beginning to be recognized for their significance. One of them, Nipsachuk, that appears almost not at all in colonial written documents. It turns out, right, is a site of great importance for Narragansett, Nipmuc, and other people. And there has been some very important archaeology happening there recently that has actually located some material traces of events there. So Nipsachuk is now coming back onto the map as a place of importance. The final place I wanted to bring us to is back to Peskeomskut. So we had thought about this beautiful fishing place, thousands of years of sustenance and livelihood. And here's another view of what the river, the Connecticut, looks like around there. Communities had gathered here in the spring of 1676. They had moved here strategically to replenish themselves with the fish. Many had been starved out of other locations, and they know that there is going to be sustenance here. They had also come together to strategize and to think about how they would respond to the next wave of English violences. They are approached by the English from a distance who seek to make a treaty with them. The terms of the treaty are so egregious and offensive that they reject it, because this treaty, if they had signed onto it, would have utterly disempowered the Native communities. It is not something their leaders are willing to abide by. And again, as at Great Swamp, under many circumstances, they would have been relatively safe here. This place is pretty north of where English villages were at this point. But the English gained intelligence, military intelligence, that they were gathered at Peskeomskut and attacked the place at dawn in May of 1676. And something that I mean, these histories are almost unspeakable, right? And so what you're hearing here is an effort to find some ways to talk about things that are nearly unnarratable. But the violence that happened there is something that really people have commented on, is how the English turned this waterfall and this place of livelihood into a weapon by driving people over the waterfalls to their deaths. And that kind of militarization of these cherished homelands is another part of the memoryscapes. They're enormously painful places, and also places of sustenance all at once. So with that as a short look at the war itself, I will conclude here with just a couple gestures at how I follow these strands out. And I would, of course, be happy to talk more about any of these. There are testimonies from Indigenous survivors. And here I say, Jill Lepore, even if you're reading stuff, it's right here, right? There are statements made by all of these named Native individuals in 1676. They have been taken prisoner brought into Newport, Rhode Island for a court-martial hearing. And they describe what they did during the war, including at places like Great Swamp and Peskiomscot. When I read this document, I try to approach it very carefully because these individuals made these statements knowing that their families, many of them were still out there, and that what they said in front of this English military court might bring retribution upon their surviving relations. And they also made these remarks knowing that they were likely to be executed, and most of them were immediately after this. So this is a complicated story, right? What is it saying? What is it maybe not saying for intentional reasons? It turns out the archival record is complicated too. It does not speak straightforwardly. One of the most important dimensions of this war's afterlives is the enslavement of Indigenous children, women, and others. And this pushes back so strongly against some of the dominant colonial mythology. And here I'll talk about this briefly through the lens of Roger Williams, who has this iconic status in colonial Rhode Island as a kind of ahead of his time, progressive, multicultural liberal, who kind of understood things differently. He was not really a colonizer of the same violent, dispossessive way as others. And there is truth to the fact that he had longstanding relationships with the Narragansett tribe and entered into serious forms of responsibilities with them. And also, at the end of this war, his name is first among the signatories authorizing the sale of Indigenous people out of Rhode Island into slavery. And this is partly to recoup the debts the colonizers have incurred during this war. So Native people, and here's just one other example, this is happening throughout the region. This is a 4-year-old boy who's being human trafficked. That is one of the, I wouldn't say forgotten by communities, it certainly has not been, but erased from the colonial accountings until quite recently. The geography of this enslavement is really wide, and this is actually where my book ends. It takes us across an Atlantic world and the points to which Native people were sent. And part of this is an English effort to prevent future resistance, right? Sending people away, taking their memories with them, and hoping in the eyes of the English that they would not then be able to come back and reorganize. But people come back. And there's a survivor who comes back from Barbados. He returns to his community in Massachusetts. There are other examples, right? So these stories of continuance I find among the most exciting and the most significant. This project has taken me over to England, where I found, I will not say discovered, I happened to see some records about North Africa, where at least 30 Native people from New England were incarcerated on a ship and forced to work on a galley ship in the Mediterranean. And what has happened to them, and did they have survivors, I think remains an open question. There has been very active work in Bermuda that I'd be happy to say more about, community-led work to reforge connections across this space. So to wrap things up, I'm actually going to skip over, these are more on sort of colonial memory, but the place I want to end in the last couple minutes is an example of the back and forth, these dynamics of memory and how the story continues to unfold. Until recently, this sign, which was put up in the 1930s, stood at the entrance to Great Swamp. And when I bring this into my classes and have students close read it, it elicits a lot of discussion from its very opening words, the Great Swamp Fight, narrating as if it is an equal pitched battle rather than a massacre. And from there, it goes on with supposedly the decisive defeat of Narragansett people. The sign went missing a couple of years ago, so it is no longer there. But the final path here, I want to highlight that this story has never been the only story, and Narragansett people themselves have continuously been telling and carrying forward other forms of knowledge and memory. So a couple examples. From this very same time period of the 1930s, there's this brilliant magazine published called the Narragansett Dawn that you can actually read online. It's been digitized through the University of Rhode Island, and the Tamaquag Museum, community-led, has been doing a great deal of work around the Narragansett Dawn. And I was so interested to see an article in there from the 1930s talking about Theodore Dennis Brown, a Narragansett tribal member, who is giving counter tours of this place. Mr. Brown will be very helpful to anyone seeking the historic landmarks of Rhode Island. He knows the location of every interesting spot in South County and the full story, tradition, or history of the place, and he will guide you to these under appropriate circumstances, right? So that form of memory is long continuing within the community. Also in the 1930s, Narragansett community members and tribal relations from across New England come together. This is Depression era, and create a recreated, but also very contemporary Narragansett Longhouse at Goddard State Park, and use this as a place to educate the state of Rhode Island and all the tourists who come through here about the fact that they still exist and they are still a nation and they have not gone anywhere, right? And so I see this as a very direct refutation of the disappearance narrative that King Philip's War has been mobilized into, that it is the end of. And here we can see people out on the land doing a form of gathering that has taken place for years. Gatherings continue at Great Swamp. If you perhaps lived through the 1960s, a time of great activism in many places, and also Indigenous activism, right? 1968, a gathering there that was open to friends as well. So a place of cross-cultural educational possibility. And then the note I want to end on today, and thinking about speaking here, Minnesota Historical Society and the role of state historical societies. It was the Rhode Island Historical Society that over time claimed ownership of the land at Great Swamp, a section of it, the site where the actual massacre took place. And in 2021, following years of work, and I want to stress here the leadership of the Narragansett tribe, the Rhode Island Historical Society returned this land to the Narragansett tribe. Ceremony was held there, and as this piece and others emphasize, who better to be the caretakers for this place than the Narragansett tribe? I want to end on this note because I see this as a possibility. It is a small thing. It is a really profound something. And it can have us thinking about the ways that memory can be remobilized in the 21st century and the future. And that includes land back and other forms of relations and restitution. Thank you so much. And I would be very glad to hear thoughts and questions from folks.
Thank you so much. I feel there are so many parallel land memory parallels to our Minnesota, Dakota lands.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much history you know of our place with the Bedote and Fort Snelling. Very, just kind of profound similarities. Do you think there could ever be a possibility that Bedote, Pike Island, the sacred Dakota lands, the similar thing could happen? You know, if we could learn from what has happened in the site of the Great Swamp Massacre, do you feel like that is even possible?
Thank you for this. And before we started here, I was talking with Jacob about how many connections across the continent, right? Then I've talked about kind of one area of land and water and people, but this has resonances and similar, but also distinctive trajectories elsewhere. To answer that directly, you know, I live with possibility, and here my thinking is entirely indebted to community leaders who have done this work and envisioned different routes. And it has taken generations. I'm here, you know, in the back of my mind, the voices of various people saying it's not one generation's work, it is continuous, right? And the land back conversation and actions that are happening now that I know are very live in so many places, including right here, you know, that is gaining some traction. I mentioned this, you know, to the leader of the place where I work today and said, how might the college where I'm employed, where we have students, you know, learning and studying, how might we think about our own relationships and the land, right, as not sort of secondary to that, but actually integral. And I think knowing that there have been some pathways that have taken a lot of effort, I mean, years and years of conversations and disagreements and persuading and strategizing, knowing that this happened in Rhode Island, right? It can happen in other places and is happening in other places. And I really do, I mean, I feel very deeply about all of this, including the role of places that do history work, whether it's a museum or a school or a library or an archive, who are not just caretakers for, but can actively shape a different future. And much of my days, I feel these days around where I am in New England is to assure people that things can be different, right? They do not have to be what they have been for a number of centuries. And part of what writing this book has helped me see is how recent some of these supposed, timeless memorials and names actually are, in the sense of colonial words or sites. It's a monument that went up in 1950, and yet it has become treated locally. Here, I'll give you, you can tell I skipped some of these things. Wasn't sure if we would get to this, but it's been treated as this immutable part of local landscapes. Where's the, oh, I skipped it here. Well, this one will do. But also the resistance to that. And this, I think is a sign, this is quite close to Peskiamskid, where there's a lot of progressive dialogue, I would say, happening. And also when it comes to actual transformations, things are at a different place on this. And the example here, there was an effort a couple of years back that I was so excited about to see the headline in the news. Oh, they finally addressed these historical markers, and then found out that the state DOT had allocated money to repaint them, right? But there was no other form of dialogue on this or intervention. And I actually wrote to the DOT and naively thought, oh, they're going to, and it was a thank you for your comment response. And, that had me realizing just how locally based a lot of this action needs to be. And if something in Hadley, say, were to take root, I do think that has possibilities. Sometimes thinking at that larger scale of the nation or internationally can be daunting, although it is certainly related. I realize there are several different pieces of it, but there is so much that is happening as we speak that is on this note of reparation and restitution.
Christine, I have a question from one of our Zoom audience. And the question says, what challenges have you faced as a non-Native historian in researching Native histories? And how have you approached those challenges?
Thank you for that question. I think about this every single morning, and who should be doing this work, why, from what position, if at all. And the image I had at the very outset about the Stockbridge-Muncie community is really foremost of my mind these days, what it means to be in support of a community's own work. And so a couple responses to that question. First, to be really clear that I would never presume that what I'm doing to be speaking for a community, that communities have their own practices and sovereignties, and also building relationships with people and getting to know people over time in these particular places, and have a sense if this work is something that is desired. And if so, then to go and see if there are things that I can bring through, say, archival research that may support or be of some use to communities' own efforts. Should also say that there's a great deal that I do not put in scholarship and published writing or in a presentation like this, because it's been made clear to me this is not for public consumption. This is, perhaps shared so that you will have important context, but this is not to be out there. And that comes as an outcome of many years of, say, desecration of grave sites and plundering of really, really sensitive places. And so for me, as a researcher and a scholar, I'm in history, but even more so, I'm in Native American and Indigenous studies. And the ethics of that field are intensely focused on community accountability. And I am in the midst of figuring out what that looks like and what it means to partner with a community or to not, right? And to know that there's certain work that communities alone will do. In terms of teaching, I will say this, that for many of the undergraduate students I work with, a big impact of being in the classroom is dismantling these colonial mythologies, but not only doing that unpacking work, also seeing all of the pathways of knowledge that communities have made and maintained over time. And that could be tribal-based libraries, right, who steward and caretake and share out their own resources. It could be museums, it could be educational programming. And I see that as a teacher, probably the most impact of anything. But I appreciate the question very much. Thank you.
History can be a puzzle put together. It can make a mosaic. We are more familiar with the Six Nations of the Iroquois, the Democratic Confederacy. How do the tribes of this area, New England, fit into that whole Eastern or New England mosaic of Native American history?
Thank you so much for this. And this is where I will say that is an unwritten chapter of my book that the editor said you have to stop writing. And she said, if you go beyond a certain number of pages, right? But because of that, I wound up drawing some boundaries. And one that I really love this question that I really did not get into has to do with, quote, New England and the tribal nations here and their relations to the West and to the North, especially, right? And that includes Haudenosaunee communities and Mohawk communities where there's a long and complicated, sometimes contentious, sometimes otherwise, history of diplomacy and interaction. And there are experiences of Native survivors who are trying to leave this region altogether to go further west and encountering different complexities in trying to refashion a community or establish themselves to get out of the way of what's happening in New England in the 1670s. The other place that I think is connected to this that I gesture at the end of the book, but don't go fully into, is north. So if you look north to the Abenaki communities along the St. Lawrence River, like Odanak and Wolanock, Native survivors are strategically going north to not only get out of the wave of violence in the South, but also to seek protection among allies and also kind of use as a tool the new France imperial sphere up there. And so today there are still really important connections between that northern region and the communities there. There's a longer answer to this, but I'd love to chat after about that. Thank you.
This is a personal note that maybe you could comment on. At the call of North American Indigenous people, I looked into my ancestors, my land, and discovered it was European Indigenous, including English and Scottish. And what I've discovered so far, my last name is Kent, is that my ancestors probably may have participated in this war, that you're in the King Philip War, which I didn't even know the name of until today. And what I'm wondering, and the thing I've been doing is dealing with a lot of grief and shame of being a settler colonialist to this land. My indigeneity is European, and that's a whole other story. So why did the trauma? I guess what I'm trying to get at is trauma. My ancestors came with trauma, then they inflicted trauma, and sort of dealing with that on a deep, even a spiritual, emotional level of grief, of shame, and I know a lot of us in the audience may have similar backgrounds to mine, and sort of what would you suggest that we could do on that level?
Thank you for that. And I'm thinking here, half my family is Italian American and based in Rhode Island, and a lot of family conversations have involved this area, right? And what it means to be learning about and potentially doing something in relation to that. And in Rhode Island, there's a lot of Italian American investment in Christopher Columbus, right? And so that's one area where I have spent some time thinking about how I might, at a family level, be sharing out some resources, and to do that in a spirit of we're all learning about this. Some of the really interesting local activism that has begun to take root in different places, including Paskiamskat area, but other places, has really, a piece of that has been around family connections and people sitting with that and then thinking and then doing more than thinking, right? And beginning to reach out, beginning to think about what a form of support or alliance or solidarity, and all of these are words to use carefully, might look like. And that can be powerful, especially thinking about place and the different investments that people may feel in a place, to feel very connected to it. And so that process of recognizing that feeling of maybe love or something may also be really complicated and have these other dimensions to it that are painful or traumatic. The other thing that I have on my mind is there's an emotional level to this work that I think you're describing. And there's also a political social action piece of it. And those don't always need to be the same thing, right? As you know. And so how to translate some of the personal things that people may be experiencing into a form of action that is appropriate and desired. And I wouldn't say I have the answer to it, but something like the example of, here, let's get off of this one. We'll go back to, here's an example, right? At Paskiamskat, there has been a set of relationship building between white European town residents and community members, including representatives of the Narragansett tribe, to think about what reconciliation might look like. And that word carries a lot of weight. And what I emphasize is that in the words of Lloyd Wilcox and others themselves, reconciliation doesn't mean the end of something. It means opening the door to a new set of possibilities that then require people to step through that door and do that work. And so that is something that really sits with me. The final part of my book, I actually title, drawing on a phrase from a Narragansett context, of reopening history, and what that process involves ethically, right? To do that really hard work and know that the future is going to require quite deliberate action. It's not just going to happen to be different. So that's some way I would think about that. I also would recommend that film that I had the poster for, We Still Live Here, about the Wampanoag language, because one of the MIT linguists, Ken Hale, who is instrumental in supporting the community and bringing back language, is a descendant of Roger Williams. And they talk in that film about the many different views on that and how they have navigated those relationships. So that film, highly recommend. Thank you.
Any last questions before we wrap up?
Come behind you.
Behind me.
Why was it King Philip's War? Obviously, that's not a name that he was born with. So how did that come to be?
Thank you. I should have said that at the outset. A traditional practice in many communities that people might take on different names at different points in their life, right, in relation to significant events. And one of his other names, Metacom, he takes on the name King Philip as relations begin to occur between English colonizers. And some of that is a reflection of English leadership expectations, right? They have in their mind a sense of what a king is. They're coming from England and seeking that similar kind of governance. And there's a lot of misunderstanding that goes into that. King Philip is not operating in the same way that King Charles or any of the other, right? There's a very different form of counselors and advisors and consensus-based decision-making, but he does take on that name. And also his brother Wamsutta takes on the name Alexander. These are biblical references, actually. And if you're interested in this, Jill Lepore's book actually has a good discussion of some of the biblical origins on that. But something I really wrestled with in this book is whether to keep using that name, given the incredibly important role that he had as a leader on this, and also knowing that he was never alone, that there were so many other Indigenous leaders, including women like Quayapan and Awashanks. And so how to both speak to that salience and disrupt that, or recognize that there have been other understandings of his role in relation to this much broader phenomenon. Thank you.
One last question here.
Welcome to Minnesota. I teach fifth graders in St. Paul American history, and I was at a conflict and colonization in 17th century New England that you spoke at the NEH, and I asked this in Donna Spears. Then, how do you teach about the brutality of the war without, because I listened to you talk at Brown with, as it Lisa Rogers, about it's so unspeakable, but how do you avoid the sanitization of, you know, what happened at Groton or Mystic or what happened in the swamp, you know, not using terms like Great Swamp Fight. That's kind of something I wanted to ask you about in teaching the Great War. Like, where do you come down in terms of the brutality part? And then secondly, could you just share with us what you know about the efforts of the Southern New England states, like departments of education, to decolonize and change the memories of the students as they come through those states?
Wow, we could, those are really big questions. I appreciate that. I appreciate that so much. No, those are again top of my mind these days. So one place that when I think about different levels of or different ages that people may encounter this at, that elementary school is so crucial. There is so much that is happening at that age when students may go to a local history museum and see something or read something or watch Disney, right? And the importance of doing that truth telling in an age appropriate way that fits developmentally with where people are at. And so some of what I would point to are the resources that communities have produced, their own children's books, right? Or multimedia that are really intended for a fourth grader or someone in middle school that do not sanitize, but are also very careful about the language and how much and how it is shared, right? So that's one approach. In my own classroom, I do not bring in ever images of Indigenous ancestral remains, of other places of great sensitivity, right? Or try to kind of project on the screen all the time scenes of trauma. That can be very painful, especially if there are Indigenous students in the class or students from other communities for whom this is a very, very live something. It's not abstract. So that kind of attention to where people are at, and also knowing young folks may need a lot of time to process this, right? Hearing about New England genocide, just that phrase, is a great deal for many, many, many students and adults, right? To actually sit with that, as you know. The other question was around education. So Southern New England, I actually was going to say something about Northern New England, if that's okay. No, I should say Southern New England. There are community efforts around curriculum. So Mohegan Tribe has a number of things in process where their own educators are developing a Mohegan specific curriculum that really steps into a huge void around Indigenous experiences, not just histories, but also presence. And they're beginning to bring that forward. Also Mashantucket, the Pequot Museum that I had the image from, they have so many visitors come through. And I see that as a critical place of truth-telling and intervention. The way that they handle the violence, one example of that, there's a film inside the Mashantucket Pequot Museum titled The Witness, which is about the Pequot massacre. And it is extremely difficult to watch, and it's incredibly important. And it's in a theater where you can choose to go in, right? And it then comes with a lot of surrounding material so that people don't just enter unaware into that space. And that, kind of different levels of access and information, I think are important in thinking about how this work gets out there. The other example from Northern New England, the Wabanaki curriculum, there have been longstanding efforts in the state of Maine to decolonize that state curriculum, and the work continues, but that is one example of a state that has made some kind of formal commitment to that type of education. So things are happening. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Dr. Christine DeLucia again.